This year, what we're going to address this Tisha B Av is the tragic events, the terrible events of the spring of 1096. The effect on what was almost a destruction of all of Ashkenazic Judaism. We're going to come back to Ashkenaz in a second. But where we're starting from is an interesting issue. The Baal HaMaor, at the end of Masechta Pesachim, asks a simple question. He says, why is it that during Sfiras HaOmer, the mitzvah of Sfira, there's no Shehecheyanu? Whenever we come to a certain time of year, each and every year, for instance, when we take the Lulav and Esrog, other mitzvahs, when we go into the Sukkah, there's a Shehecheyanu. How come by Sfiras HaOmer there's no Shehecheyanu? That's the question that bothers the Baal HaMaor. And the answer he gives is that the whole institution of our Sfiras HaOmer, Bisman Hazeh, and again, the Rambam would disagree with this, but all of Chachmei Provence, all of Chachmei Ashkenaz, and most of the Chachmei Sfarad agree with this opinion, that our Sfiras HaOmer is D'Rabbanan Bisman Hazeh. And what is the whole sphere that we engage in? It's a zecher to the mikdash. It's a certain sense of lament over what? That we had a mikdash. We had a time when the Jewish people had our own autonomy, had our own land, and we would bring the Omer from the Judean hills, the Nebraska, the Kansas, the breadbasket of Israel, the Judean hills. We know that from Megillus Rus, from other places. And what would happen? The whole procession, they would bring in the Omer, and they would start to count. We have no Hakravas HaOmer Bisman Hazeh. We have no Beis HaMikdash Bisman Hazeh. So we have a count that's strictly a zecher. It's a remembrance to what? To the days of old, to the glorious days that we lament that we don't have. And in fact, Ameimar on Daf Samech Vav and Menachos, it says, Ameimar Monei Yomei v'lo Monei Shvuei. He would only count the days and not the weeks. Why? To reflect and to demonstrate that our Sfira Bisman Hazeh is a pale reflection. It's an empty shell of the ultimate mitzvah. Now the question that we're going to ask is, and we're going to bring this back to Tisha B Av a little bit later in the Shir. The question that we have is, there's an interesting practice that Chachmei Ashkenaz have. And that is what? Our mourning, our Nihugei Avelis, our mourning during the Omer, starts at Rosh Chodesh Iyar and goes until Shlosha Shemei Agbala. It doesn't start at the beginning of the Omer, like the Sfardim, like what was the original Minhag Ashkenaz, of starting the Omer when? At its inception. But rather it starts at this later point, Rosh Chodesh Iyar. And the question is why? That's question number one that we'll come back and address. The other issue is, why in general is there a period of mourning of Avelis during the period of the Omer? And again, this is a Tisha B Av Shir, and you'll see how it relates to Tisha B Av. The original Avelis, the Nihugei Avelis that we adopted during the period of the Omer, we know is a function of what? Of a function that the 12,000 Chavrusos, the 24,000 students of Rabbi Akiva from Antipras, which is in the northern Galilee, until the south of Israel, his students literally traversed the length and breadth of Israel. What happened? Those students were wiped out. And the Gemara makes an interesting term. It says azkara. Azkara we translate as diphtheria, the disease of diphtheria. But Rabbi Soloveitchik explained the azkara that they died of on Tisha B Av, that azkara was Lashon Saginor. It was a euphemistic language that is used to describe the fact that they were annihilated, they were butchered, they were destroyed by the Roman forces in the aftermath of the Bar Kokhba revolt. Because one of the events that we tragically, one of the great tragedies in Jewish history that we mourn on Tisha B Av is the slaughter, and we don't have historical records, but somewhere between 500,000 and 600,000 Jews. What we believe was 1/3 of world Jewry at the time. 1/3 of world Jewry was wiped out in the aftermath of the Bar Kokhba revolt. The revolt, as you know, that took place in the early 130s, some 6 decades after the Churban Beis HaMikdash, after the destruction by the Romans of the Second Temple. The destruction of the Romans of the Second Temple started in 66 in the Golan Heights. In Gamla, they worked their way through the Galilee, south to Israel, concludes in 72. The last fortress or the last stronghold of Jewish resistance is Masada, that falls in 72. The Beis HaMikdash falls in Av of the year 70 of the Common Era. And the Romans used 4 platoons. The platoon, I'm using that term, was 54,000, battalion of 54,000 soldiers. That's what it took. The Romans were very proud. They had the historian Josephus Flavius, right? Josephus Flavius, Yosef ben Matisyahu, who was the leader of the Jewish revolt in the Galilee. When he hands over Yudfas, when he hands over that community in the Galilee, he becomes the Roman chronicler, the Roman historian, where they describe how they defeated the Jewish people. And they're very proud, and there's a glory to the victor, there's a glory to war. There's a romanticism that the Romans make of the war, and they describe this. But when they defeated the Bar Kokhba revolt some 6 or 6.5 decades later, we're not sure, was it 130 to 133, 132 to 135? We know it was the first half of that decade, of the 14th decade. And it just took 9 battalions. Not 4, but 9 battalions. The Romans had to go as far as Great Britain. They had a crack battalion there. They had to take them all the way through Europe, all the way across the Mediterranean to get them to help with the fighting and to finally defeat Judea. And when they defeated the Bar Kokhba revolt, they butchered, massacred, and slaughtered innocent men, women, and children. Not the Jewish soldiers, not Bar Kokhba soldiers who were defeated in the war, but literally there was a slaughter. And we're familiar with the aftermath of what happened. They didn't allow the bodies to be buried. Lo nitnu lekvura, the Gemara in Brachos says. And here you had a situation where they plowed over thousands and thousands of acres of land in Israel, that never again would Israel become fertile. Never again would the land of Judea be populated by people and be supported by rich and plush agriculture. That's why, by the way, in the aftermath of the Bar Kokhba revolt, what do you have? There's a small Jewish community in the north, in the Galilee, in the Golan Heights. But the Jewish community of the south is almost Judenrein as a function of these events. What else did they do besides plowing over thousands of acres with salt? They plowed over the Temple Mount. They plowed over the city of Jerusalem. They renamed it Aurelia Capitolina. They gave it a pagan name, and they made it a capital offense to refer to it as Jerusalem. They renamed Judea, our homeland, they renamed it Palestina. What did they do? They thought the biggest way to slap the Jews in the face is to prohibit Jerusalem from being called Jerusalem, to put a pagan god up on the Temple Mount, to do what? To force the Jews to call it what? What's Palestina? Palestina, the Romans, they may not have been correct, but they looked into our history. And they thought, who was the worst enemy? The greatest slap in the face we can do to the Jews is take the worst enemy of the Jews. And who is that? The Pelishtim. Because they studied our Sefer Shoftim, our Sefer Shmuel. They knew the historical account, the decades upon decades of problems we had, the death of Shaul HaMelech at the hands of the Pelishtim, etc. The loss of the Aron Kodesh, the dissolvement of Mishkan Shiloh that had been our capital for 369 years. And they said, we'll rename it Palestina. So what happened? From the time 135, 136, somewhere in that range, when they named it Palestina, until 1948, the country was known as Palestine or Palestina. We were the Palestinians. Those of you who remember, the Jerusalem Post, before it was called the Jerusalem Post, was known as a Palestine Post. This is all in the aftermath of the Bar Kokhba revolt. And of course, the miracle, the hand of God, the bracha, we make hatov ametiv, that we say the fourth bracha of benching, that what? That eventually, shenitnu l'kvura, the Romans did allow us to bury our dead. Shelo hisrichu, the miracle of the providential miracle that the bodies did not rot over that long duration when they lie there in the hot climate of the Middle East. And in the aftermath of the Bar Kokhba revolt were the Hadrianic decrees. We studied this morning Kina Chaf Aleph, the 21st Kina, Arzei Levanon. We read on Tisha B Av about the Asara Haruge Malchus. 8 of those 10 that were martyred as a function of what? That they defied the Hadrianic decrees. What were the Hadrianic decrees? That the Romans were going to stop the Jews for once and for all, and they were going to destroy the Jews by defeating Judaism. The Rav wanted to say it was Jewish apostates, like Elisha ben Avuya, based upon a Yerushalmi. The Rav said this in other sources, that they went and worked with the Roman authorities, and they came up with decrees that they felt would undermine the whole Jewish religion, the whole Jewish people, that essentially would dissolve the Jewish people. And what was that? No public Jewish education. We read about Rabbi Hanina ben Tarajon, who was wrapped in the Sefer Torah, Rabbi Akiva, who was taken to the Colosseum in Caesarea and Caesarea, and how every day he was brought out, and they took iron combs and they literally ripped his body. He was well over 100 years old. And what they did to him, how they tortured him. Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava, who was killed in the Galilee, in the mountains near Usha, for giving smicha, that was a violation of one of the Hadrianic decrees, because the giving of the smicha would do what? It would facilitate, it would allow for the continuation of the Masorah, the continuation of the Jewish education. So getting back to the death of the students of Rabbi Akiva in the aftermath of the Bar Kokhba revolt. The Rav said that unlike the victory, the Roman victory in 70, there were crimes against humanity. There were heinous, horrific crimes, very similar to what the Nazis did when they plowed over Treblinka, or they plowed over Sobibor or Belzec after there were revolts at these death camps. They didn't want anyone knowing about the atrocities they committed. The same thing with the Romans. Because to butcher innocent men, women, and children, there's no glory to that. That's not about the victory of war. That's about absolutely sick, horrific, heinous activity. And that is something they tried to cover over, the Romans. They covered it over. And they didn't want it. Jews couldn't even write about it. And that's why in the Gemara, in our annals, when they record it, they say they died of azkara, diphtheria, which again is a euphemistic term, lashon sagi nohar, for the fact that they were butchered. With their death, with the death of the Talmidei Rebbe Akiva, was essentially the death of the Masorah. Rebbe Akiva was the Baal HaMasorah. The whole traditions of the school of Beis Hillel through Rebbe Yoshua, his one Rebbe. The whole traditions of the school of Beis Shammai through Rebbe Eliezer ben Horkanus, his other Rebbe. When it says Rebbe Eliezer ben Horkanus, Shamuti, some say it was from the school of Shammai. And Yoshua was a student, Rebbe Yoshua was a student, one of the last students of the schools of Hillel. The whole tradition of Judaism went through Rebbe Akiva. And the Masorah was almost destroyed. Judaism was almost lost. And it should have been lost. It was the superhuman efforts of a man who, as we said, was over 100 years old. And he took these 5 young men, Rabbi Meir, who was the greatest of them all, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, Rabbi Yehuda, who after the abetment, or so to speak, the non-enforcement of the Hadrianic decrees, it's Rabbi Yehuda Bar Ilai, who actually becomes the Nasi, the head of the reconstituted Sanhedrin. Rabbi Yossi was the 4th, and Rabbi Elazar ben Shammua. Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Elazar ben Shammua. These 5 young men, Rabbi Akiva works with them. And Judaism is saved through these 5 young men. And he transmits the Masorah as an old man. He had every reason to roll up and to die a depressed, beaten man after his whole life's work. After 6 decades of his life's work was destroyed at the hands of the Romans. But he didn't do that. And Judaism was almost lost. It was that close. One of the greatest miracles in our history was the fact that in the aftermath of the Bar Kokhba revolt, Judaism was not lost. It wasn't defeated. It wasn't destroyed. The mourning of the deaths of those 24,000 students, the 12,000 chavrusas, the mourning that we commemorate during that time that they died, that they were butchered and slaughtered, that's what? It's the loss of the Masorah. It's not just the loss of them and the others who were killed, the Jewish martyrs. It's the loss of Judaism that we commemorate. The reason that on Lag BaOmer, the 33rd day of the Omer, there was a miracle. That day the killing stopped. So there's a mourning period that goes till that point, and it stops. There was a tradition, some mourned from Pesach through Shavuos, with the exception of Lag BaOmer. Others stopped at Lag BaOmer. We know that when there's a hefsek, a break in the Avelis, it stops it. So you have the 2 traditions. The tradition that the Sephardim observe from the beginning of the Omer till Lag BaOmer, and a second tradition throughout the Omer with the exception of Lag BaOmer. But one thing that never existed, even in Ashkenaz, in original Ashkenaz, you didn't have a tradition of starting at Rosh Chodesh Iyar. And that's the question that we have yet to answer. What happened in May and June of 1096, in the months of Iyar and Sivan of 1096, is that what originally was thought that there would be a French crusade under the leadership, under the brainchild of Godfrey of Bouillon, that there would be a French crusade where people were let out of prison. If they would go and free and emancipate, they would liberate the Holy Land, Palestine, from the Muslim infidels. And that knights, which is a glorious term in literature, but knights were nothing more than thugs with authority. They would go, others would go. All, so to speak, the lower echelons of society, all the brutes, all the people that were looking for action, the criminals. What would happen? In the name of God, in the name of the Father, they were going to do what? They were going to travel and emancipate and liberate Palestine from the infidels. And it was a terrible time for French Jews, and they were extremely scared of what was going to happen. Because after all, they were the local infidels. And the German Jews, and we have records, the Jews sent money from Germany, they made collections. They said, we will pray for you, the French Jews. But they themselves were not concerned and not worried. And what happened? In Germany, a second crusade started. Concurrent, same time as the first crusade. It's known as a People's Crusade. It was not led by the fathers of the church. It was not led by the religious aristocracy. It was a People's Crusade. It was the masses. It was a mob scene. And instead of them traveling to the Ottoman Empire to liberate the Holy Land, they started to travel north up the Rhine River. And they said, if we're going to loot and have spoils and become wealthy, we've got our own infidels in our own backyard. In the great Jewish communities of Speyers, of Vermeisa, Worms, of Magentia, Mainz, Speyers, Worms, Mainz. They, as well as other communities along the German Rhineland, were destroyed. What happened? These communities, and let's take a step back to appreciate the destruction of these communities. They became the center of all of Judaism. We know that from the 3rd century through probably the 10th, 11th century, the center of Judaism was along the Euphrates River. The great yeshiva of Sura that Rav had started, the great yeshiva of Pumbedisa, the Gaonim, way after Talmudic times, these great academies, questions of halacha, philosophy, questions of importance from throughout the Jewish world were always sent to where? They were sent to the Euphrates River, to Sura, to Pumbedisa, because not only did that contain the majority of world Jewry, it contained the intelligentsia of world Jewry, the scholars of world Jewry. The North African community, we know this from the Cairo Geniza, used to send their questions there. It was true of other parts of the world. And what happened? Slowly but surely, starting in the late 8th and 9th, more the 9th and 10th centuries, the 11th century, Jews, for business opportunities, for other opportunities, they settled in areas in North Africa, and then the North African Jews crossed the Iberian Peninsula with the Moors, and they settled Spain, Portugal, those areas. And Jews come to Italy. They come through Italy. And through Italy, they go into the German Rhineland, into Germany, southern Germany, northern France, into Bohemia, and today what is Austria. So you have the development of Ashkenaz, and you have the development of Sfarad. Sfarad through North Africa into Spain, Ashkenaz through Italy into what eventually is the German Rhineland, northern France, these areas. The great, great schools and the seat of Jewish learning slowly but surely transfers from Babylonia to Mainz. The great Rabbeinu Gershom Ma'or Hagola, the one who enlightened the diaspora. Just to give you an example, when he convened a group of Ashkenazic rabbis to meet in the year 1000 in the city of Worms, that's where they made the various charamim. We're familiar with some of the charamim. But the point is that he was the master of the Masorah. He and his students, who set up schools not only in Mainz after he passed away, but in Worms as well, they were the tradition. The great, great learning that took place in Babylonia now transfers through Ashkenaz, through the students of the Rabbeinu Gershom. In fact, before we come back to the convocation in Worms in 1000, just to give you a sense, Rashi's commentary, what was it called in its time? It was called the Kuntras. The Kuntras are the notes. The notes of what? The notes of the tradition of how to explain the Gemara, how to understand the Talmud Bavli that were taught in the yeshiva of Rabbeinu Gershom. In other words, the Masorah transferred through that yeshiva. Students from Spain, from Babylonia, from France, from Germany. Rashi was from a small town, Troyes, maybe 200 families, a small town in northern France. Where did they send this great young man, this brilliant young man? They sent him to Mainz, to the yeshiva of Rabbeinu Gershom. And others, from Italy, from Germany, from throughout the world. That's where the scholars went, because that was the seat of Jewish scholarship. And through the students of that yeshiva, as they developed and they settled Germany, Ashkenaz, or Ashkenaz is the Hebrew word for Germany, it was the seat of the Masorah. Small community, not large. All of Ashkenazi Judaism at that time may have been 10, 15, 20,000 Jews. It was not a large community, but it was the seat and the basis of Yiddishkeit. What happens? The People's Crusade of May and June of 1096. They slaughter, they butcher. We have Crusader chronicles. We have eyewitness accounts of what took place, of what happened to Ashkenaz, Regensburg, other cities as well. And that community, that was the basis of Judaism, was almost lost. It was almost annihilated. Had it not been for the fact that Rashi, a student of the yeshiva, is brought back by his own community. Normally we say, Ein Navi Be'iro. You don't have a prophet in your own hometown. It's easy to be a prophet somewhere else. It's easy to be a rabbi somewhere else. But in your own hometown, when they remember you as a kid, they remember you in diapers, they remember you on Simchas Torah twisting knots in the tzitzis, It's hard for them to look at you as anything different than a kid. But the greatness of Rashi was that his own community wanted him, a small community. And he asked to bring a number of students. Rabbeinu Simcha, the author of the famous Machzor Vitri, another group of students who eventually, some of them became his sons-in-law and produced Rabbeinu Tam, Rabbeinu Shmuel, the Rashbam, produced the Rivan. You have what? You have a small school in Troyes in this little town, and if it weren't for them, the whole Masorah would be lost. We don't have a Rashi to Masechta Nazir. The Kinos that we read this morning, Kina Chaf Beis, Chaf Hey, when they speak about the events of the German Rhineland, and they give us the dates, and they tell us what took place in each of these towns on Rosh Chodesh, Sivan, and Shavuos, etc., on the 23rd of Iyar, in Spires, in Worms on Rosh Chodesh Sivan, and they tell us, and they tell what was lost. And they describe, Mi Yafli Nadarim, and we don't have a Rashi on Nadarim, we don't have a Rashi on Nazir. The tragedy is, because we don't have a Rashi, we don't have anyone else who can convey the Masorah, who can convey what was the Masorah. Learning Masechta Nazir, learning Masechta Nadarim is extremely challenging, because you don't have the Rashi. Mi Yaflim Nadarim, the Kina says. So if it weren't for the fact that Rashi survives, very much as an analogy to, if it weren't for the fact that Rebbe Akiva, at that advanced age, that he took these 5 students, Judaism would have been lost. Judaism would have been decimated. And that was the case, likewise, with the destruction of the German Rhineland. So the Taz, the famous Turei Zav, the commentary on Orach Chaim, he quotes it. He's a later Achron, lives in the 17th century. But he's already quoting it from the earlier Achronim and from the Rishonim. That the reason Minhag Ashkenaz changed, the reason that Ashkenazim observe Avelos from Rosh Chodesh Iyar, the 33 days through the Shloshish Yemei Agbala, is because it's to commemorate the loss of the Masorah. Just like the original Nihuge Svira is to commemorate what? The destruction of the Masorah by the Romans in the aftermath of the Bar Kokhba revolt, with the death of the 24,000 students of Rabbi Akiva, the Balei Masorah. So too is our Svira that we as Ashkenazim observe to commemorate the destruction of the Masorah of world Jewry that went through mines and went through worms and went through the students of the Rabbeinu Gershom. And had it not been for Rashi resettling in France, where the French Crusaders under Godfrey of Bouillon, they made it extremely difficult and extremely challenging for the French Jews. But the butchering and slaughtering and annihilation that took place in Germany did not take place in France in 1096. And just to give an example, you're all familiar with Av HaRachamim. The original Minhag Ashkenaz that's observed by the Breuers community, by other communities that observe original Minhag Ashkenaz, Av HaRachamim was written in the 12th century. It was written in the generation after the First Crusade. And it was originally said 2 times a year. 2 times a year, and that's how the Kahaladas Yeshurun says it. The Shabbos before Shavuos, to commemorate what happened in Worms and Mines, and the Shabbos before Tisha B'Av. The Black Sabbath, as Ashkenaz refers to it, Shvat Shabbos, the Black Sabbath. What happened? In Poland and in Eastern Europe, who they originally had the practice like Ashkenaz of saying it twice a year, a pogrom happened, a terrible event happened, and they started saying Av HaRachamim more often, not just twice a year. And eventually, slowly but surely, we ended up, because of the tragedies of the long history in Ashkenaz and Eastern Europe, we ended up saying Av HaRachamim more often than not saying it. So in the end, whenever there's a Kiyum Tachanun, whenever it's a week where if it had been a weekday we'd say Tachanun, we say Av HaRachamim on Shabbos. So any time that there's a Kiyum Tachanun, you'd say Tzidchascha in the afternoon, we say Av HaRachamim in Ashkenaz. And it commemorates the martyrs, those who died al Kiddush Hashem for the sanctification of God's name. But it was originally written to commemorate the sanctification of the life of the Kedoshim during the destruction of 1096 of the First Crusade. And what's also a tragedy is when you read about the First Crusade in history books, they glorify it. There's nothing glorious about that First Crusade. And anyone who knows has any sense of true history knows it was a terrible black mark. It was a terrible black mark on the church. It was a black mark on Christianity. And it was a stain that throughout history will never be removed. And we commemorate it. We commemorate the destruction of Ashkenaz here on Tisha B'Av, today on Tisha B'Av. Why? In the Kinos itself, and if you look in Kinnah Chaf Beis and Kinnah Chaf Hey, and the Rav used to spend time each year in Boston when he taught the Kinos at the Maimonides School, and the Brisker Rav spoke about this. They themselves thought of doing what? Of setting up a national day of mourning for the Jews of Ashkenaz, for all of Ashkenaz. But they said you cannot create it. All churban, all devastation, all destruction is mourned, is fasted for, is observed on Tisha B'Av. No different than in the aftermath of Bar Kokhba, that even though it took place in Iyar and Sivan, so too the destruction of Ashkenaz took place in Iyar and Sivan. But it is mourned. We sit in Avelis, we sit every Jew in Shiva, and we mourn that loss and that destruction when? On Tisha B'Av. Because once Chazal set that up, what they were teaching us, the Rav would say, is that all churban, all tragedy stems from churban Beis HaMikdash. From that state of siluk hashchina, when the perceived presence of God, when that intimate relationship, that intimate providential relationship is removed by God allowing Titus to come and destroy the building, that the Beis HaMikdash goes from being the place where man encountered God, where it was a place of an intense providential relationship. Siluk hashchina is what? It now is no longer, it's now all it is a building of stone and wood. And a building of stone and wood can be destroyed. That is the greatest tragedy. And all tragedy and all suffering stems from that state of affairs, from that providential state of affairs. Whether the tragedy takes place on Tisha B'Av or whether the tragedy takes place at other times during the year. Nationally, as a nation, as a tzibur, we mourn it this time of year. In fact, and I want to go on a parenthetic digression, the Rav Zatzal, was very close with Menachem Begin. Menachem Begin used to come to meet with him and visit him in America before and during the time he was prime minister. And one thing that the Rav, they had a long relationship. Menachem Begin's father was the Parnas. He was the leader, the lay leader of the community in Brisk. And the Rav's grandfather, Zatzal Reb Chaim, was the Rav of Brisk. And the one time that the Balabatim didn't listen to Reb Chaim was that Menachem Begin's father, the other Balabatim, they wanted to have an askara, a memorial for the Shloshim of Theodore Herzl in the main shul in Brisk. And Reb Chaim said, absolutely not. And the Balabatim didn't listen to him. They said, we're going to have it anyways, and they did have it anyways. But there was a relationship going back many years that had its positive and its challenges between the Begins and Soloveitchiks. And one thing that the Rav impressed upon Prime Minister Begin, who felt like a Jew, who acted like a Jew, who lived like a Jew, he was the Jewish Prime Minister, is that Tisha B'Av, because of the act of Knesset, of celebrating it in the middle, first of all, of Nisan, when you don't have Tachnun, but even leaving aside the problems, and there are big problems with observing it in Nisan. Originally, if you look at the records of the Knesset, they wanted to observe it on Pesach because it was a commemoration of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. The Jewish people have matured quite a bit since then, and our commemoration of the Shoah, of the Churban Acharon, is not a function of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. It's a function of every component and every aspect of the Churban of European Jewry. And what happened was, Menachem Begin went back, and he wanted to change Yom HaShoah to Tisha B'Av. And he understood from what the Rav had taught him. And the Rav opened up the Kinos, Chaf Beis and Chaf Hey that we've been mentioning, where the Chachmei HaMasorah, the survivors of the First Crusade, the French and German scholars, decided that you don't set up a separate day of tragedy, a separate day of national mourning. National mourning only takes place when? On Tisha B'Av. And when Menachem Begin went back to Israel, intending to change it, the educational establishment in the state of Israel, they said to him, Mar Begin, it's the children are not in school on Tisha B'Av. Tisha B'Av is when they have vacation, it's summer vacation. If we want to teach the Shoah, we have to teach it during the school year. The reason we don't want to move it at this point in time is we think it's too important educationally. And Begin acknowledged that. In the end, it was never moved. They never changed it from Yom HaShoah to Tisha B'Av. But theologically, and we're not here to get into whether it should be changed or not, theologically, the Yom HaShoah for all Jewish destruction and all Jewish tragedy is when? Is Tisha B'Av. And that we see from the Chachmei HaMasorah of Ashkenaz in the aftermath of the destruction and devastation of the Masorah of Ashkenaz. Parenthetically, I want to mention, the community of Worms would fast on Rosh Chodesh Sivan. We know you don't fast on Rosh Chodesh. Rosh Chodesh is a moed. It's a day, we specifically, if anything, we have a Suda, we don't fast. They had a practice, and it was questioned. Many Gedolim questioned that practice. But the Jews of Worms always fasted on Rosh Chodesh Sivan to commemorate the great destruction, the annihilation of the community at the hands of the Crusaders in 1096. And there was one minhag of those who observed mourning, not the 33-day period Rosh Chodesh Iyar through the Shloshish Me'agbala, but they observed it from Chav Gimel Iyar through Gimel Sivan. There were many different minhagim. We quote the standard minhag Ashkenaz, but there were some in Ashkenaz that had the minhag. They started on the 23rd of Iyar. What's the 23rd of Iyar? That was the beginning of the destruction of spires. Those who were not within the fortified city were killed, were butchered on the 23rd of Iyar. Just parenthetically, the name Shapiro, many Jews have the last name Shapiro. Shapiro means someone who comes originally from the city of Spires, Germany. It was a terrible time. If we look in the Crusader Chronicles, we see an issue. Many Jews, not only did they kill themselves, Al Kiddush Hashem, or they were butchered by the Christians, Al Kiddush Hashem, but some even killed their children, because they saw the plans of the Christians. They would kill the adults who would not accept the Trinity, who would not accept baptism, and then they would take the children and raise them as Trinitarians, as Ovdei Avodah Zarah. And we have cases of parents killing their own children, Al Kiddush Hashem, rather than their children being raised in a life of paganism, a life of Trinitarian worship. And you can imagine, the pain, the suffering, and you read, you want to cry. When you read the Crusader Chronicles, the testimony of those who survived, you just want to cry. And that we mourn. That's something that we mourn on Tisha B'Av. We mourn all of Jewish tragedy, not just Churban Beis HaMikdash, but the destruction of the communities. We spoke a couple of years ago on the OU Tisha B'Av video. We spoke about the valley of the communities and how we commemorate the loss of the shtetl, of the villages, of the towns, of the big cities, all throughout Europe, in Romania, and Hungary, and Germany, and Galicia, and Lita, in Lithuania, in Poland proper, in Transylvania, in the Carpathian mountain range, and how each of them had their minhagim, each of them had their divrei Torah, their gedolim, each of them had their zmiros, each of them had their unique way of observing a Pesach, a Sukkot, a Rosh Hashanah, with their unique tunes and special way that they observed. And that phenomena of observing the loss of the communities, we also go through that as we try to appreciate what existed in Worms, what existed in Spires, in Regensburg, in Mainz, Magentia, and how they were they were the basis of Judaism. Not only were they the basis of the Masorah, we still have tunes that we have on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur that create and define the mood for different tefillos that go back to the time of the early Rishonim, to early Ashkenaz. The Masorah that's observed by communities. Rabbi Hamburger is trying to maintain that Masorah, the famous Rav Hamburger of Bnei Brak, Shoroshe b'minhagei Ashkenaz. There are communities under Rabbi Prager and Ramot. There are communities that are starting all over Israel. There's a community in Baltimore under Alexander Weil. But the most famous of all, Kahal Adas Yeshurun, the community that Rav Breuer and the survivor community of those from Frankfurt am Main established on the Hudson River in Washington Heights. The Masorah of Ashkenaz, that goes back to these times. It goes back to the Talmidim of Rabbeinu Gershom that defined Judaism for the world, that produced the material that it produced. Where would we be without that Masorah? You think about where we'd be without what Rashi has taught us, and how his Talmidim, his grandchildren, started the whole movement of the Balei Tosfos. Eventually, they tried to rebuild Germany. And remember, Germany was not a country. We live in a world of post-nationalism, just like France wasn't a country. There were different areas. But through the Balei Tosfos, Jews came back to Ashkenaz. And they produced Gedolim, the Ravya, the Or Zarua, eventually the Maharam Mirottenberg. His students, the Mordechai, who was destroyed, right, Rav Mordechai ben Hillel was destroyed in Nuremberg with his family under the Rindfleisch massacres in 1306. Rabbeinu Usher, who had to flee first to Provence and eventually to Spain. So they tried to reestablish Germany. And it was defeated and destroyed many different times. And once again, in the aftermath of 5 crusades, in the aftermath of the Black Plague, the bubonic plague, the Black Death, once again, Ashkenaz was almost Judenrein, as a function of those who died in the bubonic plague, and as a function of the terrible, terrible anti-Semitism and slaughter and butchering of Ashkenaz at the hands of the German community, the community in Bohemia, the Austrian community. More Jews died at the hands of Christianity because they blamed us, because they had primitive notions of science. And in their superstitious mentality, they thought that that the Jews were devils. At first, they thought that we poisoned the wells, and they realized that the wells were not poisoned by Jews. But what? They assumed that we gave omens and curses. They didn't understand about bacteria. They didn't understand about microscopic virus and bacteria. And they slaughtered thousands of Jews. In the Maharil in the early Achronim, in the aftermath of that, what did he do? He collected the Minhagei Ashkenaz, and he saved that Masorah that once again was almost wiped out. And it was the Maharik who settled in Italy, the Mahari Bruna, the Maharam Mintz. You had a few great Gedolim, the Trumas Hadeshen. These early Achronim, the Trumas Hadeshen, the Mahari Mintz, the Maharam Mintz, the Mahari Bruna, but the Maharil, the greatest of them all, the Maharil, the Mahari Weil, Yaakov Weil, they maintained the Masorah, and they kept it. And as Jews left Ashkenaz, some of them crossed the Pyrenees and went into Spain. That's why so many Jews, Sephardic Jews, have the last name Ashkenazi or have the last name Tsarfati, because they were German Jews or French Jews who found respite in Spain. It didn't last that long because we know what happened in the 15th century in Spain. But most of them went east. They went first into Galicia, then to Poland, then to Lita. Eventually it spreads from there to Hungary, to the Carpathian Mountains, to Slovakia. Ashkenaz survives. It survives primarily in Poland and Galicia and the Ramah of Moshe Isserles. It's a family of German Jews who settled there. And the Masorah is maintained, and the Masorah survives. But it was the Masorah of Ashkenaz, and it was almost annihilated. And we mourn and we commemorate those Jews who were everything to us, who transmitted the Masorah that had been transmitted from Moshe Rabbeinu ad hayom hazeh. And the sacrifice that they made, their own sacrifice, the sacrifice of their children, the sacrifice of those communities, the sacrifice of the richness of what a holiday meant, the richness of understanding every aspect of Jewish law, of Jewish philosophy, the richness of how to lead our life as a Jew. We commemorate their destruction, we commemorate their loss. We do it primarily on Tisha B'Av. But what the Taz was sharing, the Taz in the name of many earlier Achronim, is that the minhag we have that changed, that didn't originally exist in Ashkenaz, of observing an Avelis period, a mourning period, from Rosh Chodesh Iyar through Rosh Hashanah Bala, that was a function of what? A commemoration of the destruction of the Masorah. No different than the original Nihugei Sfira that were observed by all of Klal Yisrael, which were a commemoration of the destruction of the Masorah, the Talmidim of Rabbi Akiva. These are the themes of the 22nd and the 25th Kina. And this is what we observe on Tisha B'Av, the day when we sit in Shiva, when every Jew is in mourning, and we mourn the life. We mourn the lives of the Kedoshim. We mourn their Masorah, their teachings, their traditions. We mourn the fact that they died al Kiddush Hashem. Thank you.